Yo, what's up, Serpa Squad? Tanner here, and I'm back with something a lot different than usual. I've been wanting to do this for a while and figured now was a good time. Many of you know my background is in fine arts. Usually I apply those principles and techniques to projects with living elements. Doing so adds a whole other dimension to the art that's a lot of fun. However, I understand that not everyone has a green thumb or wants to deal with care. Maybe you still want to make something though. In this one I'll combine my hobbies once more and make something easy that requires no upkeep. Let's get to work. Based on the title of the video, you already know I'm making a mini goldfish pond. When selecting materials, I wanted to use as many natural elements as possible to keep with the general theme of this channel and to make things easier. To start, I have this really neat plant dish which will be the vessel for the entire design. I also have various substrate components including fine sand, coarse sand, fine gravel, pea pebbles, river rocks, and cocoa fiber. As you would imagine, we'll utilize plant-like elements to keep with the natural theme. That will include dried mosses and lichens. These are readily available at any craft store, online, and even from stores like Walmart. They're technically still the real thing and a perfect option for those of you who can't seem to keep moss alive. I also want to include some trees. I'll make those out of river birch branches and dogwood branches I sourced from my backyard. Of course, we need to hold the pieces together, and for that I have hot glue, super glue, and epoxy resin. Lastly are the miscellaneous components including measuring cups for the epoxy, insulating foam board to build up the land, acrylic paints, and various brushes. Now that we have the appropriate materials, we can make some art. I began by creating a circular formation of large river rocks in the plant dish. Once I made a good layout, I attached the rocks to the dish with hot glue. It didn't take much, just enough to hold everything in place. I glued more river rocks on top of the existing structure to make the water feature deeper. Then I attached smaller accent stones to make things look more natural. To add more detail, I went back and filled in the cracks. For that I used super glue and various substrate components. Like you've seen in other videos, I applied some glue and covered it with substrate. I started with the fine gravel. Then I worked in the coarse and fine sands. These elements were pressed into the glue and the dish was turned upside down to remove excess. I repeated this until the entire inside of the pond looked seamless. Afterward, I poured some of the extra materials back into the pond for the bottom. Here's a glimpse of what the pond will look like. Now we can address other aspects of the design. I stuffed chunks of foam between the rocks and sides of the dish to fill in the space. It will also create a good foundation to attach the trees. I took smaller branches that looked like mini trees and stuck them through the foam. My vision is to make a forest of trees that frame the pond and help create a nice little scene. In doing so, I primarily used dogwood branches with the birch as accents. Once the branches were situated, I hot glued them in place. It looks good, but there's still a lot to do. Let's mix up some epoxy resin. This is a 1-to-1 mix, so it's very easy to measure out and use. After mixing up a small batch, it was poured into the pond. I let it cure for about an hour and realized I should have put plants in the bottom. Luckily it wasn't totally set up and I was able to drop in a few segments of reindeer lichen. I let this cure for a few hours until firm. I mixed up some acrylic paints and began to add the inhabitants. You all know that I love my goldfish, so that's what I decided to paint. I started with the basic shape of the fish. More details were added as I went. I didn't go crazy on these ones though, since they're deeper in the water. 5 fish were painted on this layer, with most of them shoaling together as goldfish do. Once the paint dried, I added more reindeer lichen and epoxy. I let this layer set up like before. It looked good, but I wanted to add more fish. This time I painted them larger and with more detail than the previous. Again, I started with the basic outline of the fish for placement. I went back with various layers and colors of paint to get the look that I liked. Sure, they're not the most realistic looking thing I've ever painted, but they're good enough to get the job done. I let the paint dry and mixed up more epoxy. I poured this in to bring up the water level once more. I let it set up for a few hours, but at this point it's still somewhat viscous. I want to stick plants in the partially cured resin. I noticed sporophyte on the patches of haircat moss that look a lot like cattails. I snipped these off and made a little stockpile. I used strands of sheet moss to create the foliage for the plant. They were cut into smaller pieces. I thought these strands of haircat moss could be used to mimic parrot's feather. I also have segments of fern moss that could be used as another riparian plant. Anyway, all I did was use a pair of tweezers to strategically place the elements. I got a bunch of moss strands in first and added the iconic piece. I think it resembles cattail quite nicely. I repeated the process 2 more times. After that, I added pieces of haircat moss in areas that branch out from the cattails. Again, this is being used to mimic something like parrot's feather. Lastly were the pieces of fern moss. I'm not really sure what plant these resemble, but they definitely help recreate the transitional bog area between land and water. With all of the plants addressed, I poured in the final layer of epoxy. This is just a thin layer to further submerge some areas of the plants. It was left to cure until the epoxy was pretty firm, but not completely set. I went back with tweezers and made indentations to mimic ripples on the water. There's one more detail I want to add before moving on. You know how it goes, I can't do any water feature without the floating plants. Initially I wanted to make water lilies, but I didn't think there was enough room. Instead I used a fine brush and green paint to mimic the look of duckweed. In doing so I made the frequency of dots higher near objects. This is how duckweed tends to grow, so I wanted to replicate that look when painting. Here's what I ended up with. I think it looks pretty neat and fairly natural considering what I did to make it. Now that the water feature is done, we can make our way to the land. First I put super glue on some areas of the stones. I covered the glue with cocoa fiber like I did before with the sand. Doing this will help transition into the land. I trimmed away strands I felt would take away from the aesthetic. From there I filled in the rest of the land area with loose cocoa fiber. I probably didn't need to do this, but it helped fill in some of the space. On its own this doesn't look very good. Luckily a covering of moss makes everything better. I went through the whole design and placed moss accordingly. Some areas were glued down to keep everything in place. I thought that sheet moss alone looked flat. I added other mosses throughout for contrast. I think these help create a better sense of depth. I finished the land area by sprinkling sand and fine gravel around the pond. This should make the transition feel more natural. It's almost done, we just need to address the trees. For that I'm using 2 different colors of reindeer lichen. The dark green will be attached to the dogwood branches and the light green to the birch branches. I simply applied hot glue to the ends of the branches and pressed the lichen in place. As I built up more foliage, I also glued sections of the lichen together for stability. I worked from one side to the other and gradually filled in all of the spaces. It took some work, but I think you'll like the final result. And there you have it, my take on a mini goldfish pond. I haven't done anything like this in a while, so it was a good change of pace. Something less serious if you will, and overall I really like how it turned out. My only complaints are that I wish I would have sculpted the fish or used figurines instead of painting them on the epoxy, and I should have made the pond bigger. Story of my life, the water feature could always be larger. Anyway, I'm curious to know what you think. I know it's different, but I've been meaning to do something like this for a while, and I had a lot of fun with it. If you liked it, let me know and I'll try to incorporate the arts more frequently in my other work or between big projects. I'll be back next week with the regular programming. Until next time, Serpa Squad, have fun making your own works of art, take care, and peace.